Right. If any technical difficulties were to occur, the meeting will continue. If you wish to continue to participate, you must report to this location at Lunenburg Town Hall. Please be advised and plan accordingly. The agenda lists all the topics which may be discussed at the meeting and are those reasonably anticipated by the chair. Votes may be taken as a result of these discussions. Not all items listed may in fact be discussed, and other items not listed may also be brought up to the extent permitted by the open meeting law. Okay, I just want to mention for the record that tonight we have 3 members participating in person, myself, Chris Menard, and Dave Passios. We have 2 members that are participating remotely, Jay Simeone and Evan Waters. Also, our town manager, Heather Lemieux, is participating remotely. Members Tom Gray and Tom Baelish are unable to participate this evening. Would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Are there any announcements?
Got nothing
None?
this evening.
Okay. I would just like to call everyone's attention to the town's Memorial Day ceremony, which will be happening on May 30th at 10 a.m. at the Veterans Memorial Park, which is right across from the Eagle House on Memorial Drive. We have the usual Memorial Day ceremony that'll involve the police and fire department color guards. We will have musical performances by students from Lunenburg High School. We have the Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts running a ceremony. And we also have keynote speakers that'll include our Select Board Chair, Tom Alonso, and Brigadier General Norrie will be our special guest. He is an active duty Army general who'll be speaking about some of his experiences and observations in relation to Memorial Day. It's rain or shine, so come on down to Veterans Memorial Park at 10 a.m. on May 30th. Also, this weekend, there are a couple of fundraisers running for the Boys and Girls Club. There is a car wash running Saturday morning in the parking lot to the Boys and Girls Club at the Mossman building. And there is also a boot drive happening at the intersection of Main Street and Mass Ave and Lancaster Ave. And that will run from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., I believe. Is there any public comment? Seeing none, I will just make one public comment. I had indicated to the members that I was going to make a decision as to whether I would seek reappointment after town meeting. It is now after town meeting, and I have advised the Finance Committee, Appointments Committee, that I will be seeking reappointment and have not heard as of yet if when they are convening an appointments meeting. For the chair's report, tonight we will be discussing the summer calendar. So please be mindful as we discuss really the town meeting operations, the year in review and goals and topics for summer months, when and how we would like to go about convening over the course of the summer. This is not something we will finalize tonight, but we will at least need to figure out tonight when we will meet in June.
Yeah.
And then we'll go beyond that, probably in our last meeting in June.
Peter, could I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
I just got a text message that there's no sound,
Oh,
and I'm not sure if that's on
okay.
Zoom,
Can
or
you
if
hear us
that's
on the
on-
Zoom? You can hear us okay on the
Yes.
Zoom, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
it must be on the other feed then.
All right. So,
An issue with the Facebook audio.
okay. So we're being advised that there's an issue with the Facebook audio, and they are trying to resolve that. So not quite sure how I would communicate that, given that there's no audio, but
I could send it to the one person.
yeah,
that
maybe you
sent
could
us
put that in the
message.
chat or something, and hopefully people will know. Okay, good to know.
Yep.
Okay. Moving right along. Celtics are tipping off at 8:30, so we need to keep moving here. Town manager, finance director report, Mrs. Lemieux.
Hello, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hoping the sound level is at a acceptable level, so it's not a booming voice coming over the
We can hear
room.
you fine here. Yeah.
good.
Okay, all right. So I'll just give some updates that I gave to the select board at their last few meetings, since the finance committee hasn't met since what was it, April
28th, I believe.
28th. Okay, so at the May 3rd meeting, I gave an update about the Green Communities submission, which I think Dave Passio's already given, but so that grant I submitted on April 22nd for a total of 187,000 towards the conversion of streetlights to LED, 5,000 towards the purchase of the hybrid cruiser, and it's on the fiscal 23 capital plan, and 10,000 towards administrative costs. We received proposals for design services and project oversight for converting the streetlights to LED, but as a group, the Green Communities Committee decided to reject all bids and go out to bid for a full turnkey operation, which would include installation. So a lot of communities do that as one package deal. So that's something we'll be working on in the near future. Another update was we have been receiving and submitting for reimbursement for emergency paid sick leave. And that was, a fund was created by the state under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. So we have received a total of $68,693 to date. And that ended mid-March. So that's, there will be some possible additional funds that we receive reimbursement that we haven't received back from the state yet. Updates on grants. The school received an $18,000 grant. I think as a chairman that you had referenced this, the school committee meeting regarding impacted Chapter 70 aid that's being used towards new scoreboard. The state announced a new statewide funding for winter recovery assistance program. Our portion of that is $272,678. So I'll be working with the DPW director on priorities for that funding, and that has to be expended by June 30th, 2023.
Mrs. Lemieux, can you say again what that was for again?
So that's titled, it's a new funding, and it's titled Winter Recovery Assistance Program. So the eligible expenses are rehabilitation, reconstruction, resurfacing, or preservation of roadways, including sidewalks and bike lane paths. And it can include repair, replacement of traffic control devices, signage, guardrails, and storm grates, or road striping and painting.
Great.
Yes. Update on some capital projects from the fiscal 22 plan. The public safety building chiller replacement. The chiller, when we awarded that contract, the chiller was ordered by the contractor, but due to supply issues, that won't be delivered until August. And that's being worked out as a solution for the interim. The Flat Hill Road culvert construction. We had applied for community project funding through a federal earmark through our Congresswoman Trahan's office. They submitted it, or we submitted the request to them, but they have a limited number of projects that they can submit. And unfortunately, it didn't make it to the Appropriations Committee. But doesn't mean we won't continue submitting requests in the future. So we still have the small bridge grant application to Mass DOT that we're waiting to hear on as well. The 2 marked police cruisers were received in April, and they're just waiting on parts for them to be upfitted. The Ritter ADA ramp and building envelope construction, and the town hall building envelope construction, those plans are all completed, and the public hearing for those, one was supposed to be tonight for the Ritter building, but that had to be rescheduled due to a quorum issue with the APDC. And so both hearings will be on June 6th. In other updates, the 30 School Street project, the funding that we received through the state, the $50,000 that we received as an earmark, that project just wrapped up. So that is completed as far as the state funding money. And our email migration project is underway. We're about 40% complete with employee email addresses being migrated, with the rest being migrated by June 3rd. And then we'll begin the board and committee email migration. But that process, there'll be a communication that goes out, as well as a pre-migration training available for any board and committee members, and a post-migration training available for board and committee members.
Are the old emails being forwarded to the new domain? Because
Yes.
like, so in the old email web app, it's still auto-filling the old email addresses. So like your, HLMU@lunenburgonline.com. Does that automatically get forwarded to
It does.
the appropriate recipient?
Yes.
And are they deleting inactive emails?
We delete those as we go along, and then for the new email licenses, we'll reassign those licenses to new, say a board or committee member resigns, that license will get reassigned to the new board or committee member. Or
Is
same
that done on an annual basis?
That's done when it happens.
When what happens?
If there's a resignation or a vacancy, it's done when it happens. So if an employee
That's right.
resigns,
No, that's not what I'm seeing. When I go in there, there's a lot of emails in there that are, I know where people are no longer on the board or committee.
Yeah, I think,
Unless it's
Jay, one of the things that we ought to probably forward to the IT director, because I've noticed that too. There are a lot of names that are in the directory.
Yeah.
But just because it's in the directory does not necessarily mean that there's an account associated with it. So there's definitely some cleaning that needs to go
Yeah.
on, but hopefully, because we're going to a new domain, hopefully we can start from zero and then make sure that that's kept clean going forward.
we're in the process of reviewing all of them right now. So for the new licenses. But that is done. So it's just, is this a directory on the website?
Yeah, so when you like put
Yeah.
in a name on the
That's-
website and it gives you a list of options,
Yeah.
you often see names on there that you know are no longer affiliated with the town.
right.
No, so those are, those email accounts likely are not active, like you said, Peter. So when a board or committee member resigns, we notify our network administrator, and he deletes them from the email directory on the back end. So they might be showing up on the website as part of that directory, but on the back end, they're unsubscribed.
As we go
Okay.
to this new domain in Microsoft, obviously it's a different platform. Are there are there policies and procedures relating to these practices that are written someplace and are being updated?
That's something that we'll be working with our IT company on.
Okay, so that's something to just kind of, earmark is a question that I'm just curious about, because I think that some of these things and it happens all the time. And I've worked for a dozen companies in my life, and we say we do things, but they're not necessarily done. And they're also not necessarily written down. So you can't really hold anybody accountable when they're not done. So we need to do both. We need to make sure that it's written down and also that it happens. So.
That's all I have.
Okay. Just one quick question on the cruisers, Madam Town Manager. When those enter service, first of all, do you have a timeline as to when those 2 new cruisers are going to enter service?
I think still probably depending on when the parts come in, I can't say.
So we don't know. We don't have an expected date at this
Yeah.
point.
I think the hopeful date was sometime this summer.
Okay. And has the police chief determined which vehicles are going to be taken offline and brought out of service when that happens?
I think both were additions to the fleet. And that's how they were presented.
Okay. Could I request some detail on that? Because that, I recall back in FY22 that there was at least one addition to the fleet on that capital plan, but the way it was represented, I don't think it was clear in terms of how that was represented in the budget presentation that the police chief presented. And what I'm getting to here is once we get the replacement vehicle that we approved for FY23 and the F-150, my understanding is that we were going to be at a total fleet of 14 vehicles. But given that those 2 are additions, I'm not sure if we're going to be at 14 or 16. So I'd like to know kind of what the end state is in terms of the size of the fleet.
If you allow me to share this,
Sure.
I have the capital plan presentation.
I was going to say, I thought it was spelled out in the capital plan.
Yep.
But Peter's talking about the 2 that are going in this service.
Right, I'm talking
this
about
year.
I'm talking about the 2 that are coming from FY22
Right.
plus the 2 that are coming from FY23. All I really want to know is
Okay.
what's the size of the fleet when that's all said and done?
All right. So FY23, they were both as marked additions to the fleet. 22, yeah, I can answer that question at later time.
Okay. Yeah, it's not urgent, obviously, but,
Do you want me to share the screen on the fiscal 23?
oh, sure. You want me, yeah, let me make you a co-presenter here. Hang on. I apologize. Make co-host. Okay.
All right, so they're right. These 2. Does everyone see that?
Yeah. So okay. So I misspoke and misremembered here. This is FY23. These are both additions.
Yeah.
And the way that was presented, that was going to bring us to a total of 14 vehicles. So what I'm wondering is when,
The 2 from fiscal 23,
right,
22 were brought
Yeah.
on. Okay, yep,
Yep.
I understand now.
and I apologize. For some reason, I thought that the cruiser was a replacement, not an addition. But
I can see if that.
Okay.
I can probably answer that in a couple minutes.
okay. All right. So the only other thing that I wanted to call everyone's attention to with respect to the town manager and finance director report is Karen did send me, and I sent to the board, the full report that was presented to the select board for the end of Q3 roll-up. And I did have a brief email exchange with Karen about that. If you haven't watched that selectmen's meeting from last week, I would encourage you to take a look at it. Basically, the synopsis is that revenues are, when it comes to local receipts, we've already surpassed the estimate for FY22 on local receipts, and that's largely due to tax title activity and the Meadowwoods Trailer Park activities that we've been briefed on. But that is also relevant to some of the items that we'll talk about when it comes to our policies and procedures documents and how we can better incorporate those reports on a quarterly basis into the finance committee meetings, which it's entirely on me. I don't think we did a very good job at doing that over the course of the last year. So, and actually facilitating some discussion around that in the agenda. With that, review town meeting.
Peter, can I interrupt you
yes,
for a
sir.
second?
Sure.
Going back to the 2022 capital, this is listed as priority. Well, it's on line 40. I don't know what priority it was. This is one of the working lists that we had. The police Ford 150 responder addition to the fleet mid-priority additional vehicle.
And Heather just texted us that, or I am, that both cruisers from FY22 are replacements. So suffice to say, and that was really the nature of the question is, are we, with those replacements coming online and with now having approved 2 new additional cruisers for FY23, my question is are we going to delete 2 cruisers now that we've received those FY22 cruisers, or are we going to wait until we get those FY23 additions to delete 2 vehicles?
Yeah. I know what you're saying. This does say though, in the 22, the Interceptor was to accommodate the 10-year hiring plan, which would indicate it was an additional vehicle.
Yeah.
So
right,
anyway, sort it out.
We can sort it out and
Yep.
discuss it in another meeting. I just, in my head, I'd like clarity in terms of the size of the fleet and this will be a recurring theme next year, at least on my list of topics, because I don't think that the number of vehicles are first and foremost in the heads of our department heads across the board.
Right.
And, that's a big part of our capital expenses is vehicles. So
Yeah.
I think that we should be very thoughtful about what we're doing on these fleets.
Something I was made aware of in the past couple of weeks, and I'm not sure what the circumstances are, but there is a vehicle driving around Lunenburg with sewer department logos on it.
Okay.
Which I wasn't aware of, but
I have no idea. Couldn't begin to guess. Okay. Review town meeting, preparation, conduct of the meeting, results, lesson learned, future actions. So my only, I think that there are probably 2 relevant articles to discuss with respect to town meeting. The select board had a brief retrospective discussion about town meeting. They had some discussion around, the prolonged amendments process and that sort of thing, which I don't really have any commentary on. I think that the 2 articles that are probably worth some discussion are the capital plan article, which, I think that we need to begin to formulate what, if anything, we want to do with respect to capital planning in the coming year. And Article 19, which was the 30 School Street article, and that amendment and what that potentially means in terms of that site and how that might go into a discussion about ARPA funds and potentially also the building committee's discussions about municipal office space. I also just got a text that we don't have sound, so I don't know if that's a cable
Yeah.
issue or a Facebook issue, but it seems as if it's not resolved. So apologies to
Sound on
anybody.
cable.
I'm sorry, Jay?
There's no sound on the cable channel,
Okay.
channel 8.
All right, so we've got a widespread audio issue going on here. We will continue though. So with respect to Article, are there any other articles that members feel are important to discuss?
I just briefly like to say that I think we spent way too much time and these were not financial articles, so we didn't weigh in on them. But I think, and I tried to cut off debate on one of them, that they were not properly prepared for town meeting. And to spend an hour and 45 minutes or more amending an article, the wording of a bylaw on town meeting floor, I think is just the most ridiculous place in the world to do that. Personal opinion. Thank you.
I largely concur. Having gone through, preparation for 3 town meetings now with the finance committee, I'm sympathetic to the amount of work that needs to go into these and the timeline and the discussions that, the select board in particular needs to have with various committees to vet some of these decisions. But generally, I agree with you. Now, that being said, I was pleased with the outcome of both of the amendments on the salary administration plan. I think that town meeting made a good decision on both of those. So, in the end, the system works. But in my opinion, it is arduous to say the least. So,
But there was another article also that you're very much aware of that
yep.
was definitely not fully vetted with the public before it was brought to town meeting. And there was indication that there were problems a number of weeks in advance, and it was still railroaded through to town meeting, and we spent way too much time on that.
I wholly concur. I fully agree with you. So beyond Article 6 and Article 19, are there any other articles that we should focus? I want to be a little bit structured in terms of how we discuss these.
Mhm.
Are there any other articles that you think we should bring up?
I don't think the salary administration plan was handled well. I think the select board should not have tried to amend it on floor. They should have tried to work that out beforehand. And I think there was a lot of what ifs and ramifications that had been thought about by that committee that were all of a sudden thrust upon and made a snap decision on without preparation for why there would have been pushback by, the chairman of the select board. So I felt that that was bad form, to be honest with you.
Okay. Article 6, capital plan. So I think that discussion was actually turned into a pretty productive discussion, and it was not overly prolonged.
Mhm.
It was obviously, probably it was the most money we've ever spent on a capital plan. I think that the issues that we've raised are still pertinent because we're probably looking at a lot of free cash next year too. And one of the things that I observed or thought of kind of after the fact was that, in particular, the 2 items that I had the most heartburn with were brand new requests for FY23. They weren't requests that had appeared in previous capital plans.
Yep.
And when you get into a situation where you have more money than you might have anticipated in previous years, and these new items are brought forth, and you get into the word that I was looking on the floor, and I couldn't think of it at town meeting, was discretionary, like more discretionary spending than we would have otherwise had. I think that we've kind of stressed out the process that we followed over the course of the last couple of decades, as you've alluded to, right? It's worked in the past, but I think that it needs a little more thought. I think that there are, potentially a few different avenues that we could approach to look at this, to include having a discussion with the select board about the wording of the article. Or, perhaps treating the capital planning process different with the capital planning committee, and maybe having more interaction with the finance committee and the capital planning committee. Maybe it requires a bylaw. Maybe it requires an amendment to the charter, sort of in that order of progression in terms of the severity of what we could potentially do. But, now that we're aware of it, I think that we should take some time over the course of the next few months to kind of figure out what the right course of action is without the emotion of disagreements around particular items. So in any event, I think that's my takeaway from Article 6, but I'm curious for other people's thoughts on that.
Again, just to very quickly and briefly reiterate that, my comments previously, that there are so many inconsistencies where the capital planning process is mentioned in our charter, our bylaws, mass general law, wherever you want to, even fiscal policy. That's one of the places where during this discussion, if the group going forward really wants to see some substantive change, it's all going to have to jive with each other. Otherwise, there's always going to be that argument, well, what trumps what, and how are we going to do this? Or set a policy that says this is how we're going to do it going forward. But again, I think the charter trumps policy. I could be wrong in that.
Well, but,
order,
with respect to the issues that we were wrestling with, though, the charter is vague. So admittedly by everybody. So, I think that where there is vagaries, it either comes down to interpretation, or a policy can be put in place, or a practice, right? And with respect to the practice, it's literally the wording of the article, right? If the article is worded differently, it leads to a different outcome. And the wording of that article is really up to the select board, I would believe, but I'm not even 100% sure of that. So I think there are things that we need to kind of untangle there.
Yeah. It also speaks to the argument, though, that I also brought up, that I believe the intent 20 plus years ago was to take that argument piece out of the capital planning process, because they were seeing disastrous results with individual articles over a long period of time previous to that. So that needs to be taken into consideration. There aren't going to be a lot of people around for the next 5 or 10 years that are going to remember what went on in those years.
It's funny, Chris and I were having a discussion at town meeting. He had gone back and looked at some old warrants, I assume, Chris, from the 90s, and said that there were capital plans in the 90s.
Yeah.
I grew up, my grandfather died when I was 2 years old, but he was a regular attendee at town meeting and quite a opinionated character. I know it's hard to believe.
Definitely, I remember.
And I grew up often hearing a story of a particular town meeting where there were a slew of very low cost, seemingly no-brainer articles that were argued relentlessly. And then there were like 3 or 4 articles that were like, 5-figure articles, which in those days was a lot of money, that passed immediately. And then there was another low cost article, and he made an amendment to increase the dollar value of that particular article by 10x, with the logic that, the high dollar items pass easily. It's the low dollar items that are creating the problems for us. So let's just spend more money on this, In any event, the point being is that you're right. Town meeting went through arduous processes in figuring out what we're going to spend money on. And that is not, my intent is not to create an arduous process, right? What my intent is to do is to apply a little bit more scrutiny and thinking, particularly when we get to these items that have not been really looked at over a period of multiple years, but are, hey, there's going to be a lot of money available for capital. I'd really like a new boat or a, whatever it might be. What I'd like to figure out is a way to be able to apply a reasonable amount of scrutiny to that does not put too much power in anybody's hands, I guess is what I'm getting to, but also doesn't create a mess, right? And I don't think we were in a position this year to be able to accomplish either, to find that.
We could
Define that
very
approach.
easily have gone in the direction that it would have been, could have been a mess.
Absolutely.
And,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
very easily and very quickly.
Yep.
The other thing, Peter, I'll just mention, and I think as long as we're in the financial situation comfortably, how should I put it? We're in a good financial position, and the longer we stay in that type of position, the more critical that what you're proposing is going to be, because we're not going to have those discretionary items that will be sitting in the list for 2 to 3 years.
Right.
Because in the past it was, well, there's no way the money's there the first year. So you put it in 2 to 3 years ahead of when you know you're going to be desperate. And then by then that's one of the deciding factors. Well, it's been on the list as a need for 3 years already. We got to bump that up on the priority.
But I think that there's some, that gives people some time to think about it. And,
I
if you had
agree.
told me 3 years ago that we would put a patio in the back of the Eagle House, I would have told you there's no way that that's happening. And I'm not, and with all due, I think it's a great project and I supported it, but
Yeah.
I never would have thought that would have actually come to fruition.
Right. And that goes to affordability at the moment.
Right.
Or speaks to.
In any event. So, I think that this is something that deserves perhaps a little bit more structured thinking, or maybe even a proposal in terms of how we could go about exploring the options on this. I think that, probably some offline conversations with the town manager and with town council would probably do us some good in terms of moving this along. But, before I take that action, I want to get the sense of the board that this is something that we wanted. And by the way, I have no intention of taking this action until, probably when our new fiscal year is begun and we're into a new fiscal calendar.
Right.
But, does the board generally feel that that's a course of action that we should pursue this summer? Chris, yes?
Yes.
And I think we
Evan
came
and
to
Jay,
that
yeah.
conclusion just before town meeting, that we needed to support the article now because there were very important items on there, but we do it saying that this process needs to be fully vetted going into next year.
Jay or Evan, any comments on that?
Well, anytime you get more, detailed information, to support budget requests, it's a good idea.
Same here. I agree with pretty much everything you guys are saying so far.
I think too, Peter, and to your point, I did
It's-
understand your concern that what the capital planning committee heard, no one else in town heard other than in minute notes, which are, not very detailed
No.
in most cases. And that's something that I had mentioned at one point, but that process happens so quickly. If you don't jump on it right at the beginning, then it's done and over with before you even realize you haven't documented it enough for the public.
Well, the good news is there's been a fair amount of squawking about it, mostly by present company, that hopefully that'll get rectified next year.
Right.
So,
So I think all the documents that go up to capital planning should come to us as they're being discussed real time. And I think that the meeting itself should be broadcast.
Yeah.
And minutes should be out within a week. So,
There isn't a committee on this, in this town that gets them out in a week.
I don't-
I mean, you're putting pressure on a single committee that works for what, 4 to 5 months of the year. I think that's unrealistic. I have a problem with bringing paperwork to other boards before they've been vetted by the board that's tasked to vet them. They've got to go through the weeds first before they go in the process. It's just like the school budget. Starting to release information at the very beginning of their process. By the end of that process, nobody knows what number was what to begin with and what got changed in the middle and what got changed.
Well, the documents are public documents.
Yep.
So, you know, there's,
we
and
made it.
again, we can workshop. I understand your
Yeah.
point, Chris. I think this is something we workshop during
Yeah.
the summer, and maybe we have a, you know, discussion with the capital planning committee as it exists, you know, this summer. We don't know exactly what that'll be, but I think that's I hear both sides of that argument. Like I'm
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
I don't have an opinion on it, but I certainly understand both sides. But the net is that when the documents go to the capital planning committee, they're public documents. So, you know, we can come up with an arrangement certainly to make sure that those documents are available to be read at least if, you know, I'm not sure that it would be appropriate to discuss them at that point at finance committee, other than to call people's attention to the fact that they're being discussed.
And Peter, I think you ran into it a couple of times that, and again, lack of the openness of what was discussed at individual meetings, but at any one given point, what the actual prioritization list was, because it changed like 5 times, and it always does in the process.
Yep.
Well,
Okay,
So the other thing I think is critical in this is a basis of estimate that's flowed through the process as well, because we've had several now in the last couple of years that have been inadequately funded, inadequately scoped. So maybe that exists somewhere in there, but we should have something on the lines of a basis of estimate.
yeah, so I think you're right about that. Or I would say accuracy of the estimate, or I don't know if the base, I mean, because everything that goes to the capital planning committee should have some kind of quote or something, right? Like there should be some,
And they don't.
it should be
all-
based on something,
And they,
right?
well, they're based on something, but they're not all based on the same thing.
Okay,
You know, that's the best I could give you right now.
okay.
I mean, the article for the survey, only because I was intimately involved in the article or the project for the survey. I did the legwork to actually get 2 quotes ahead of time before we plugged the number in. The town beach building was pulled. It was on the list originally, but that was pulled because we could not
Have a
get
number,
an
right.
estimate. But other project, yes, there are, you know, off the cuff number.
Right.
And then lo and behold, when it does get approved, it's 25% short sometimes.
Okay.
well, hopefully, if we get a new director of facilities, there should be sufficient documentation and quotes to support, you know, facility projects.
One can only hope that we have a fully staffed DPW, well, we have a DPW director now.
Yeah, I'm talking
And
facility.
a fully staffed
That's-
facilities function in both the town and the schools, and they're both functioning fully. That'd be awesome. So, okay. Article 19. So
What's
Article
Article
19 was the 30 School Street article. And, you know, this was discussed at the select board meeting last week as well. And there was a lot of, you know, disappointment on the part of the select board members expressed on that article. I voted against the amendment personally. The amendment passed 94 to 83. So it was pretty close. But I think that experience is somewhat instructive on a number of fronts. The first is that we had asbestos abatement on the capital plan for that property.
Mhm.
We had design work dealing with both the engineering for the tear down as well as the engineering for the park in a single article. You could argue the strategy behind that. But at the end of the day, I think that, you know, nobody has sold a consensus to the town on the future of that property.
Hmm.
And, Mr. Jeffries, who's actually in the meeting tonight, said at the select board meeting, we probably need to consider this now as part of the charge of consideration for the municipal building committee. Because a lot of people, said that they envision municipal offices on that site. One of the things that's kind of been ringing in my ear about that site is, I think a lot of people have been thinking, okay, that's a $3.5 million project. We're chipping away at it a little bit at a time with asbestos removal, with tear down, with services that the town can do, but there's still going to be a very large bill associated with that. And maybe that's a potential avenue for ARPA money that we have a timeline to spend around. But there's also, a looming unmet need now at Marshall Park that's grown, and there are plenty of other potential areas that money could go to. And as I think about that property, it's been a vacant building for 20 years. If it's a pile of dirt for 5 years, it's not something that anybody who doesn't know Lunenburg and drives down Mass Ave would even realize. So, as I said, I was in favor of putting a park there. I probably still am. But I think that, maybe not putting a park there gives us some options that we hadn't fully considered.
The other thing is, as I said, at some point in the last month or so, that doesn't have to be a pile of dirt after the building's gone. Very inexpensively, and probably volunteered services could touch that property up enough to make it usable as just raw open space.
Anyway, I was surprised by the outcome of that article, but
Yeah, but
personally,
Peter, it also spoke to, I think the feel of town meeting also was that those never should have been combined in one article.
Right,
And the only way to make it clear they didn't want it that way as one of the other underlying factors was to cut one of them from that article. So I think that was an issue also. I really believe there were some people there that felt, and the vote probably would have gone the same way, approve one, not the other.
yeah. I mean, I understand there's probably some natural resentment in what might be perceived as engineering of the article. But I'm not sure that it would have led to a different result if there were two articles, given the discussion. That was
Correct,
had.
I agree.
So,
I agree.
so anyway,
I know some people question whether that's really a $3 million project to landscape that area, given what we've also heard as the price tag associated with the much larger Marshall Park. So I do think if there were to be a park over there, I don't even know if is it a park, and is it going to the Parks Commission, or is it
That
gonna stay
issue
under
is
the
kind of
town
slid off to the
select
side
board?
for the time being.
no need to resolve it right now, right?
Well, it flared
Yeah.
for a while, but
So I think that whatever that was, it was just too much money, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I agree with taking the building down wholeheartedly. I think $3 million for what was being put there seemed high.
I agree with you, Chris, compared to the number that came out for Marshall Park. I just hope the Marshall Park number is accurate.
Remind me, what is the Marshall Park?
Well, it originally came out at 5 points. We just went through this last night. It originally came out at $5.7 million, and it was revised down to $5 million even. And that includes totally reorienting the two biggest ball fields, addresses parking on both the Mass Ave side extensively and the smaller one on Chestnut Street. It adds a mile of walking paths in the internal part of the park and adds two forest trails out to Marshall Pond and a viewing deck.
And bathrooms.
and bathrooms.
bathrooms,
Um,
yeah, pickleball and
Pickleball,
basketball.
basketball, dog park, and a small pocket park on Highland Street here on the end of Marshall Pond.
So
So,
that's good.
yeah,
Dave,
but
does
when
that-
those two numbers were out together,
Yeah,
they looked like there was an issue somewhere.
I can
Yeah.
understand that.
Dave, does that number include the funds that were being put forward by the Board of Health?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, you need to speak up, Evan.
Oh, I'm sorry. Does that number include the funds being put forward by the Board of Health?
No, it does not.
Okay, so in theory, so long as that qualified, it would just be reduced by what, 100,000 or so, even below the 5 million.
No, that, the 5 million number doesn't, let me retract that. The $5 million number has a number built into it for a sewer line out to Mass Ave.
Oh,
That's-
so not using septic at all. Okay.
Right. The septic cost was kept out of the numbers for the project because that was separate funding that was already in place.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
David, didn't you say there was grant money for Marshall Park?
Again, I didn't get the,
Yes, if there was grant money for Marshall Park.
Grant money?
that's our next move. We've discussed that last night. The Parkland grant application process is open right now. That I believe is a matching grant, the same as what we bought the Saliva property with. That's up to $400,000 in grant money. I don't remember how much of it we have to match, but that is a matching grant. The landscape firm that did the work for us gave us 3 or 4 other grant programs to apply for. There's a dog park program, there's ADA compliance programs, there's all kinds of grant programs that we are starting now to discuss and figure out how we are going to move forward and try to apply for those grants. And I guess I'll take this moment to just say that I'm putting out a personal plea to the public. If there is anybody out there interested and has the knowledge and the expertise in applying for municipal grants for these types of projects, we desperately need that help. And I do know that most grants have administrative costs built into them, and usually the grant writer is paid through that administrative cost. So I put that out to the public right now that that is the first phase that the Parks Commission plans to go through, because as we've been promising now for over a year, we're going to fund as much of this, if not all of this, with grant money, earmark money, or ARPA funding. I won't guarantee we're going to do it all, but we're going to do our very best to do that.
You have a phased approach, right?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's at least a 4-phase approach. We are actually going to prioritize that within the members of the commission at our next meeting. I think there would be some discussion about adjusting the prioritization or the phasing that the designers gave us, only because there's a couple of smaller projects that really stand alone and aren't dependent on any other phase. And we could accomplish those very quickly and very easily.
All right, we've wandered a little off the agenda.
Yeah, a little bit.
Any other comments on town meeting?
I like the electronic voting. I'll say that for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely a win.
And I think it allowed people to vote what they really wanted to.
Speed things
So
along.
that was,
Yep, I was skeptical at first, but I got to tell you, I think it's an absolute
That was
win,
great.
especially if you're like me, who tends to vote in the minority. I think
Mhm.
that it encourages
Yeah.
alternative thought.
do we know how many
Or
of those
expression.
clickers do we have? Does
I don't know,
town manager know?
Madam Town Manager, if you're still listening, do you happen to know that?
I don't remember off the top of my head. I thought it was 400, but I'd have to go back and look.
So for most town meetings that we'll ever have, yeah,
I mean, we came up to almost 200 at this one.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the last really big one we had was for the vote for the middle high school.
You're
I
right.
think we had like 600 or 700 people at that one.
2.5 override, we'll put it over
Oh, yeah,
400.
yeah. Definitely. All right, I'm going to move on then, unless there's any last minute comment on town meeting. All right. Review Finance Committee year in context of FY22 goals and procedures. So I emailed the members of the committee the document that we had resolved last summer. And I'm not going to read every word of it because I've been told that I'm boring when I read. But I just want to kind of touch upon what I consider to be some salient points here. And just kind of welcome opinion. The third paragraph, we get into the timelines of presentations and supporting materials. I think we had mixed results on that this year, probably better than the previous year, but I'm curious as to what your opinions are on that.
So one thing that Tom Baelish brought up a couple meetings ago, and I think it was very accurate, is we had the relevant supporting materials, but sometimes we don't even get the budgets
Yep.
in some of the presentations, and they go on, for an hour or more about just an overview of what is going on. There's things sometimes about what is changing. And that's good to the extent that there were maybe a couple new members, and it's always good to know what goes on, but perhaps we should try to limit that to like 15 minutes and make sure that the actual budget is in the material.
So Tom actually sent me an email earlier this week that outlined some thoughts. And again, I won't read that out loud. I can make it available to you, but he said, when we have department budget presentations, let's flag up front that we would like the budget detail ahead of the meeting, in addition to the high level presentation. I think that all or almost all departments have this data, but some have not provided it as a pre-read for the specific budget discussions. And in some cases, it just wasn't in the budget discussion. That's my editorial comment. And then he also said that for all budget documents, we should also have year-over-year percentage changes, which I agree. In some cases, they're there. In some cases, they're not. But, having just read this quarterly report, I think that the way that that's presented, where you have the original appropriation, the amended budget, the spend to date, like when you have that context with a new budget proposal, I think that it's very helpful for us lay people who don't do this full time to really kind of get that context into our heads. I think it's probably going to require us to maybe even put out like an example document or something for the department heads to say, this is what we want, or, but I agree. Like number one, we need that information. Number two, ideally it's standardized so that, everybody is more or less presenting the same information, and then we can get into a groove of, okay, line item 7, let's talk a little bit more about that. Why were you overspent last year? Why do you think you need less this year? Whatever the case might be.
And as you pretty much just said, it gives you the opportunity to see where we've been, where we're at, and where we're going, which we don't see we don't see it at that level in many of the budgets now.
That being the
Yes.
quarterly reports that we get?
I'm sorry, Jay, say again.
Isn't that in the quarterly reports that we get?
It is. The problem is that number one, you got to read those quarterly reports.
Yes, it's a lot of.
And if you do, you're going to be much more informed. But number two, I think that it does help to kind of look at that information side by side with the proposed budget, I think is what we're getting to here, right? Like, this is a part-time hobby for all of us. And I think that having this information packaged in a way that it's easy enough to put a frame of reference around, that can then facilitate active, informed discussion amongst all of us at the table. I think that's kind of what we'd like to get to. And I think that we've made progress, but we're not all the way there yet. And so Chris, that actually touches upon the fourth paragraph, right? Which is the quarterly reports. And and the off-budget spending in excess of $20,000. I would say, while I would give us probably a B+ or an A- on the timeliness of the materials, I didn't do a good job at getting into a discipline this year, of getting this onto the agenda and making sure that it was read out. So that's on me. We did get the quarterly reports, but, basically I asked everybody if they read the reports, and I didn't really facilitate any discussion on them. So I think that that's on me. And part of it is finding a way to frame that so that it can be had in a committee meeting discussion rather than read off of an email. And I think that needs some work. Chapter 70, on the second page. I think we did what we set out to do on that. I don't think that our efforts really influenced the way Chapter 70 worked out this year. I wouldn't give us that credit, although we did come to, I think, a good result on Chapter 70. But I think that there are, I'm 90% sure that we're going to be in a hold harmless scenario again next year, and we'll be complaining about, small Chapter 70 increases. So, I think that we did a good job to kind of flesh it out. I'm not sure how seriously our legislators take this issue. And, maybe we just hit the repeat button, or maybe we say, we pocket it for a year and work on other things. I'm not sure, but I feel like we had a good result, but I'm not sure that result was a result of our work.
Yeah, that's a good analysis because of, some of the things that we heard as those numbers were released as to where the major driving forces were coming from. I think too, that it finally fleshed out what we did this past year, finally fleshed out a fact that has been argued for years now, depending on what side of the fence you're on. Some say, oh, we don't spend enough on our students. Others say we spend way too much. And lo and behold, compared to, I don't remember what percentage level, but when you put all of the numbers together spent for our students here in town, we spend a lot of money compared to a lot of other municipalities in the state. That's basically what we got from that discussion
Yeah.
with the specialist.
Yeah, and it's driven by those formulas mostly, but it's also driven by, what the town wants to invest in education.
Right, but
And we
I
are
don't
spending
think,
above.
I don't think in the past, many people realized that the commutation for the spending per student included a number of other sources of funds.
Mhm.
We were always looking at the narrow piece, to Chapter 70 and maybe one or two other revenue sources.
Yeah.
But it encompasses all of the money coming in.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a good point too. So one other just, interesting thing that I uncovered over the course of the last couple of weeks, I found myself in I know it's hard to believe, a social media discussion with somebody over education spending. And it was relating to the amount of money that's spent on technical high school education versus traditional high school education. And in my mind's eye, we were spending like double on Monty Tech as we're spending in Lunenburg. And unfortunately, right now, our school department does not break out our cost per student, high school, middle school, elementary school. They used to, but I went looking for those numbers and we don't have them. But the way it worked out, and I don't recall the exact numbers, is we're actually spending about 20% more on a Monty Tech student than we are on your average Lunenburg Public School student across the board.
Mhm.
And I think when you bust out the high school numbers, it'll be even less than 20%. So I still don't think we're being treated fairly by the formulas at Monty Tech, but I'm less concerned that, we're getting raped there, when you look at it comparative to what we're spending, here in the Lunenburg School District. But I think that's an area that I think deserves some analysis. and not necessarily to affect a budget decision, but at least to inform the public. We had a comment made in the building committee meeting the other night by a member, throwing around numbers of a percentage of the school budget. And, whether they were accurate or not, and they weren't accurate, it really comes down to the public really deserves to know what those numbers are and what those proportions are. And usually it comes up in the town meeting presentation that the town manager does. I don't think we got into that level of detail this year, but I think it's important that people know where their money's going, proportionally. And by the way, yes, we spend between 50 and 60% of our budget on education, but we've also spent a massive amount of money on pavement. We've spent a massive amount of money on beefing up our police department, our fire department. And, we are investing in a lot of areas in Lunenburg. And I don't think that anybody is being neglected right now.
Yeah, we're still working on facilities.
Fair point. Touche.
So the second half of that paragraph deals with inviting the legislative delegation in, and I thought that was a good meeting when they came in and we actually got a chance to ask them questions, and they spent quite a bit of time with us on that. So I don't know if that's a yearly thing or.
I'd love to make it a yearly thing. I sent an email after that, and it hoped to really get into some pointed action items, and I didn't get to that in terms of pushing them to some action items. But I think that, we owe them some additional communication and probably setting up for some kind of conversation again, maybe even around the same timeline next year. We're also gonna have a new legislator for Lunenburg coming on board next year. So, be a timely opportunity to make sure that our delegation in Lunenburg is working together to address our needs. With respect to budgets being approved by all boards and commissions relating to their department function, I think we did a pretty good job on that. I don't know that there were any glaring issues on that this year.
As long as that's the reason, not the reason the DPW director quit, but.
Well,
But I think it was I think that was good. I think that, the committees that oversee those budgets should approve them or at least weigh in on them, but should have the opportunity to approve.
I agree. And then the public hearings, we basically just kind of codified this in terms of what we had done the year before. I really like the idea of kind of setting the date of that last meeting, that last public hearing, as sort of a final deadline. And that worked this year. We did what we needed to do in that public hearing on April 14th, and it was really just a cleanup hearing. It wasn't,
Right.
It wasn't substantive compared to the other hearing. So, and that's not our success. That's really the success of the town government in terms of getting that stuff together and making sure that we're ready for a public hearing. I think, interestingly, the topics that we taught, there were probably 2 articles that got a lot of amendment activity at town meeting. One of them was the salary administration plan, which we had a discussion about on the 28th of March. I believe that was the date. No, 30, whatever the date was, that public hearing date, 30th or 31st of March. And I don't recall either of those issues around Juneteenth or floating holidays being discussed at that meeting. So, in my mind, we had a pretty well wrapped up article at that discussion. So I think, we did our job, they did their job. It was issues that were brought up after that discussion that really, kind of mixed things up at town meeting. And then the other one was a non-financial article.
Yeah.
So.
I kind of felt at one point that was almost an open contract negotiation at town meeting.
Yeah.
You know, I just got that feel of that whole process, and it never should have been there.
I agree. I mean, and then to compare it to collective bargaining agreements, I mean,
Yeah,
that was an open collective bargaining agreement with little data being put on the table
Right.
as to the ramifications of the changes.
Jay, you got something?
Jay?
Just agreeing a little bit what Chris was saying.
Okay. So what I'd ask people to do is think about this document and think about, do we need another one? Do we need to revise? You know, I think it'd be good to update this annually and circulate it, you know, at the end of the summer and give department heads kind of a heads up in terms of what we're thinking about. And, you know, I think it's probably a workshop meeting or two in the summer to kind of unpack that and make sure that it's worded to meet our intentions for FY '24. Is that right? Yeah, FY '24.
Right.
Okay.
And, you know, it should be a fairly easy thing to review because at the most you're going to have one new member
Mhm.
that may not be familiar with what brought that to fruition last year, but,
Yep.
you know, hopefully they'll come online quickly.
So I had the best of intentions of keeping a list of topics and goals for summer months. And I did not do that while we were talking. So, you know, in my mind, capital plan is on the list. Policies and procedures. I think budget presentations, which is probably part of the policies and procedures, needs to be kind of fleshed out. Those are my big points for the summer. Oh, and Tom also suggested, I'll just read what he wrote. I'd like to have a session on debt and debt financing this year. We should have the financial advisor come for a meeting and walk us through the town's debt position, the rules around debt, an update in the current market, our debt capacity, et cetera. I agree. Dave and I were on a subcommittee a couple of years ago where we looked at this that kind of led to a good look at the financing position that we were in going into the special town meeting for last year around the TC Passios building, and I think informed at least my thinking quite a bit on it. I don't know that we need a subcommittee, but I do agree that we probably need an organized meeting just to make sure that everybody's on the same sheet of music with respect to our current debt situation, what we're looking at relative to upcoming projects and the policies that we have in place right now that might help to color that.
We may ask whether borrowing to the levy, I mean, appropriating to the levy limit is appropriate with the state of the economy right now as well.
I think any discussions you have with anybody that comes in, the question should always be asked also. Come up with a scenario and say, how much is this going to affect our bond rating? Because that's the first thing that comes up when somebody starts talking about borrowing money. Oh, it's going to affect our bond rating. Well, I do remember back in, I believe, Terry's tenure, there were a couple of instances where we got determinations back from our professionals that said, well, yeah, it cast a little bit of a negative shadow, but at the end of the day, won't
Not going to
affect
change
it
the
much.
rating. Yep.
Right. That's always one of those things that's always been a scarce tactic on borrowing.
So Chris, can you clarify your comment that you just made around levying to the limit? Is that with respect to bond rating and debt, or is that with respect to broader financial management?
I think it's with respect to reducing people's taxes.
Okay, so it's
That
it's more of a fiscal policy issue than specifically a debt and bond rating issue.
I think it's a direction of, do we want to continue to go forward with what some folks may consider want to have versus need to have items? You know, during a time when, you know, my oil tank was $900 to fill, and gas is approaching $5 a gallon, and, you know, prices are up, and
Yep.
I don't want to drive people out of town because,
So it's really a tax issue is really what it is.
yeah,
Okay.
tax issue.
I think that discussion needs to be had very strongly at the state level. You know, after multiple years, even through the pandemic of multi-billion dollar amounts of dollars left over and thrown into reserves. And only recently a discussion that seems to be stalling again in a tax break for the taxpayer. The state's swimming in money.
I recall when the sales tax was increased around 1990, that it was a temporary tax increase.
Yeah.
and we're Still at.
What did we get, a quarter of a percent off
Yeah.
of that or something since then? And that was triggered
It was
by
triggered by a
an
recession.
automatic trigger.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was built into the law.
right.
And that took, what, 8 years for that to even be
Yeah,
implemented?
right. I meant you're right. Okay, so capital plan, policy and procedures around budget presentations in particular, a debt discussion, and a general conversation around tax. Probably want to should we even include principal assessor in that discussion? Would that be of some value?
Perhaps, I mean, maybe it would be good to understand if that's them or town manager, like, if we were to reduce it by $1 million, what would that in reality mean to those that,
Yeah, right,
I mean, if it's not,
right. Yeah, what is the
what is the true net effect? of it?
beneficial effect? Well, as you say that, the other thing is that, and this came up in the town manager's review of the goals for this past year. She still has a project underway with respect to tax relief for elderly citizens, which, Madam Town Manager, I'd ask, do you think that we'll be at a point this summer where we'll be ready to have substantive conversations around a proposal on that? Or could that potentially help color a broader tax discussion? Hello?
Video. So I believe so. We're trying to set up a meeting for as early as next week, a follow-up meeting with the principal assessor. So I believe that we'd have substantial discussions this summer.
Okay. All right. Well, then we have more than enough to keep us occupied for the next 3 months.
Have fun.
Thanks, Dave.
I'll be here till probably the end of June unless you
Watching us on
find,
Facebook? Yeah, okay. good.
if you, that's one thing I was going to mention, Peter. If somebody really comes forward that really is hot to try to get on, you know, we can arrange that prior to June 30th.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll be in touch with the appointments committee in the not too distant future.
You think Dave still won't be in the audience?
I absolutely expect him to be sitting right there, commenting on every topic. All right. Minutes. We have 3 sets of minutes in the folder. They are for March 31st, April 14th, and April 28th. And I would gladly entertain any discussion or motions on those minutes.
I read them.
What were those dates?
March 31st, April 14th, and April 28th.
All right, I'll make a motion. I move we approve minutes from March 31st, April 14th, and April 28th.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, good.
All right. Any discussion?
I don't think I read the April 28th ones.
Okay. Do we have enough votes to approve all three without Jay's vote, or do we want to?
Oh,
We do.
We do. Okay. Jay, are you okay with that?
yeah, that's fine.
Just abstain? Okay.
Yeah.
So we have a seconded motion on the table for approval of minutes for March 31st, April 14th, and
April 28th.
April 28th. Roll call vote. Mr. Waters,
Yes.
Mr. Simeoni,
I'll abstain.
Mr. Passios,
Aye.
Mr. Menard,
Aye.
and an aye for myself. Motion passes. Minutes are approved. Committee reports. Mr. Passios.
Yep, the only thing I have is Parks Commission, met last evening. We had a 3-hour meeting. Discussed 2 or 3 items at length. And one of the biggest ones, or time periods, was discussing policy and what we put in place last year and what's being followed and what's not being followed at this point. So we've still got a lot of work in that respect. Some discussion about the beach opening, beach season, and there will be portable toilets at the beach this summer for the entire season. The beach building will be off limits. And we're moving forward. I believe the date was decided to open June 16th or whatever that weekend is closest to the 16th of June. It should be the weekend right after school closes.
So school closes, I believe, it's the week of the 13th. I don't know what the exact date is, but
Yeah,
Friday
okay,
is the
so-
17th and Saturday is the 18th.
Okay, so it's that weekend. Usually there's a 1 day for staff or a couple of days for staff to get oriented and get everything set up, and then it opens up that weekend. Some discussion about our Marshall Park discussions are still ongoing. At our next meeting, we are going to take the information given to us by our design team and the suggestions for phasing and see if we agree with those phasing priorities. As I said, I think there's a couple of projects that kind of stand by themselves, so, and they're lower dollar amounts, so we may be able to come up with funding and move those forward much quicker than the big ones. I will say that the design team suggested that the parking in from 2A be phase 2. I believe it's phase 2. It's either 1 or 2. It's very early on anyway. But that can be accomplished without disrupting the existing fields. What it does do, though, is cut off access from Route 2A to those fields. So it's could temporarily push everything onto Chestnut Street, which we need to discuss at another meeting. So we may not do it in that order. So that's up for our June meeting. McNally Field, there are some issues that have developed over there in Whalum. The small snack building with the announcing booth above it has been, I won't say it's officially condemned, but it is closed and off limits. The upper half of that building, its supports and roof structures and stuff are punky rotted. So they've been closed down. So we're going to be discussing that. It has been researched enough to be fairly certain that the town actually built those structures, because a lot of the work that's been done over at McNally has been done by volunteers and funding from outside the town. But those buildings were, to the best of our knowledge, constructed by the town, and we'll be working over the next few months to determine, first of all, are we going to demo those buildings or that structure, and what's going to replace it, in conversations with Little League and, you know, everybody involved. On a broader discussion of McNally, we put up a screenshot excuse me, of the GSI map and satellite view. And unbeknown to a few of the commissioners up until recently, we own a lot more property there than we are utilizing. And we are going to be approaching the Lunenburg Water District to start a conversation about some possibilities with their property, which abuts ours. So that's where that's going. I've got one more
The
note.
water building is the next one on Leisure Avenue.
Well, the water building, no, actually, the next two buildings on Leisure past the park are private residents, but we own the land behind them,
Oh, okay.
and that extends all the way to the water department property. And the water department property also includes 1.72 acres on the other side of Railroad Ave. So as I say, we're going to be meeting with them in early June. I think it was June 8th. I just made that contact today to have the initial discussions to see if there's any common ground that we might discuss moving forward.
Given the density in that area, it'd be great to facilitate more open space.
Right. And we have a building that, you know, in a perfect world, and again, we haven't been in the building or been advised as to what condition the building's in, but there's potential for that building to be a base of operations for park and recreation with programming and an office. And it would be on Parks property if that comes to
Yeah.
fruition. Again, very early stages, so please, water commissioners, don't get upset with me. We're just coming to talk.
We'll bring a semi-vetted article to town meeting.
There we go. And then another thing that came out of the meeting that's, I think, important to this committee and others in general, very interested in the Marshall Park project. I'm not sure how quickly it's going to be brought together, but I think it's going to be early in the summer at the latest. A suggestion was made last night that we make a presentation of our Marshall Park project to the Select Board, Finance Committee, and the town. So they know where we're at, what numbers are presently attached to it. By then, we'll have a little bit better idea as to what we're thinking, how we might phase it. And we'll have looked at the grant possibilities also by then. That's it.
You know, with respect to and I touched upon this earlier, with respect to the Marshall Park project, I think that the sooner we start having a discussion around ARPA money,
Mhm.
wherever that money goes, and I'm not saying it needs to go to Marshall, but it'll bring a lot more clarity to a lot of other things that are just kind of pending
Right.
right now. Marshall Park being probably the biggest one on that list now. And I feel like it's great to have that money, but it's bringing some ambiguity, you know, and ultimately it's the select board's decision how that money gets spent.
Right.
But, you know, I think that having more voices in the discussion earlier is probably better
Mhm.
at this point.
And pretty much the order of funding research that I think we pretty much agreed on was grant money, earmark money, and ARP money. And then last resort, taxpayer money,
Yeah.
Lunenburg taxpayer money.
Yeah, the problem is that the fuse on some of those is the fuses are in different orders.
Right.
So,
Right.
you know. All right. Any other committee reports?
The school committee met twice since our last meeting. Pretty short meetings overall. The one on May 4th, the real big takeaway from that one is that they did an initial approval of something called the Nature's Classroom, which was new to me, but apparently very popular in town. So it's not going to be the same as it was. They're not going out to the Berkshires. They're going to be doing Groton, but that will be coming back for the fall. The other meeting was on, I believe, the 18th. Just last night. Yeah, it was last night. They spent the majority of it in executive session. So it was a really short meeting for us. The big takeaway there was that they did the superintendent's evaluation. And as expected, she was evaluated very well. And I think they adopted a 2-year plan for moving forward with that one. But that was about the only takeaway really that I got from the meetings.
I was a 1982 attendee of Nature's Classroom, and it was held at Thompson Island in Boston Harbor, which was very memorable. So
I've got 2 that are going in September, so we'll see how it goes.
good, good. The Municipal Building Committee met on Monday, and we had as guests the superintendent and the school committee. It was a joint meeting. And it was principally to respond to the request that we had made around a response to, what would the school department do when and if the space that they're using at TC Passios is no longer available. And we had received a written response in advance that, more or less said that we needed to look at options for office space, but that the programs that are being run there, specifically the after-school program, the extended day program, the ACE program, and also the school linked services program, were all in various degrees of jeopardy without that space. And the discussion that ensued was, okay, we kind of understand that they're in jeopardy because of the disruption, and that staffing was a big issue that, would they be able to retain staff if they were to move, for example, the extended day program back to cafeterias and gymnasiums at the primary school and Turkey Hill. But we resolved that we really needed more information around the parameters and the limits and what could be potentially done as alternatives given that potential eventuality. And then we also had a brief discussion about Ritter in particular. There's been some discussion about, could Ritter serve as a potential school district headquarters, and perhaps even some programming in Ritter as well. And it's going to require some additional analysis and discussion. The biggest hurdle with Ritter is that the walls in the main floor and the main floor of the original building and the addition are all 3/4 partitions. And if you're going to be having, student related private conversations, negotiations, the kind of things that school administrators do, you need to have privacy. And so how do you engineer that building to that effect? And the net answer is we don't know yet. So there's work to be done there. We also had briefly reviewed the results of our work that we had done a month or so ago, looking at the Vertex and can't remember the name of the other report. TAP-A report, and looked at some of the work that had been scheduled or called out, particularly in the Vertex reports, and comparing that to the money that's been appropriated mostly through capital planning and some through just work that the DPW has done over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. And the net is that we're making really good progress in both buildings around that work. There is still work to be done, but it is not, I would characterize it as we're over the hill, at least with respect to the Vertex report. But much of the spending that we would still need to do really needs resolution around future programming for these buildings, which led to a plan for future meetings. And so we are doing, we have a couple of homework assignments for our next meeting, which will not be now until the first week in June. The first is to do some prioritization work around the prioritization that was done for TC Passios, sort of review that space analysis that was done for that project based on what we know now. How would we prioritize, uses? And then also, our chairman, Mr. Jeffries, adopted my King for a Day approach, which is to ask every member, if you were king for a day, how would you program these buildings? What direction would you put things so that we can see if there is a consensus or near consensus around some of these topics, so that we can maybe begin to get to some resolution and maybe begin to get to some town meeting articles around appropriations for particular things while we are drawing a new plan of record, if you will, that the town might endorse moving forward. So a lot of work underway, good progress, and again, we will have 2 meetings in June.
Are you marching towards anything for the special town meeting?
So Mr. Jeffrey, then I would, he's on the call. I would welcome him to comment if he feels the need. I think it's a possibility, but not a probability, but I would invite him to comment if he thinks differently.
No, I concur with that, Mr. Beardmore.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other committee reports? Hearing none. Public comment. Is there any public comment?
Go Silts.
Tip off is in 5 minutes. Seeing no public comment. Items for future meetings we've talked about. I will email some thoughts around June 9th and June 23rd. I'm not sure that we need to have 2 meetings in June. But I want to kind of take a look at what we've discussed here tonight, have a brief sync with the town manager. But I would say let's plan to meet on June 9th. And we can make we can have a discussion about June 23rd on the 9th. Oh, I see a hand up, Madam Town Manager.
Yes, just, we may have to make the town hall meeting room unavailable on June 9th due to beginning a network infrastructure project that's going to
Okay.
start.
Do you think we should find an alternative location?
Either find an alternative location or do it strictly Zoom.
Actually, I think that's probably even a better option.
Mhm.
Because it'll solve our television issues and that kind of thing if we just do it on Zoom. Is anybody opposed to just doing the meeting on the 9th remote?
No problem.
Okay. Madam Town Manager, have you heard any discussion around the legislature and governor around open meeting law past the end of the fiscal year?
I have not. I sent an email out asking that question, if any of those special legislation surrounding COVID were going to be extended, and I haven't received a response yet.
Write your representatives and senators and tell them to extend remote meetings indefinitely.
Nothing would stop us from having like what we had tonight though, right?
So we would need, I think the original open meeting law is that you need to have a quorum present.
Present.
So tonight's meeting would not be legal because we have 3 here.
Right.
So, but again, given what's happening with COVID and people's flexibility, like I think that this is an ideal situation. I mean,
Permanent.
it's not an ideal situation that people are dealing with COVID. It's an ideal situation that we're able to facilitate a meeting like this. In my mind, it's a good thing. And we have the technology, why not use it?
Yeah.
So,
Peter, if I may, just
Yeah, I
a
agree.
couple of things as my last few meetings, I just want to make sure I don't forget to comment about a few things that are still pending as I back away from the finance committee. The 2 I'm thinking of this evening are in relationship to the school district facilities. And I will, as a private citizen, be watching anyway, but the 2 concerning issues, one is the capital project for the primary building, which I'm sure we're all acutely aware of, that we keep on top of that and be updated, or this committee be updated as often as possible as that process moves forward. I don't know how that's going to flush out, but at least it's going to be fleshed out properly and done properly. The other is my comment made at, I don't remember if it was a public hearing or in one of the recent meetings, in relationship to Turkey Hill Elementary School and the category in one of their questionnaires coming that was presented at a school committee meeting stating that they were working in insufficient facilities. That was actually brought up to the school committee and the superintendent, and that is supposedly they're going to be putting together a list of the inefficiencies. So far, they've said, well, the biggest one is air conditioning. But I think that there needs to be a list put together now because that building is headed down the path of the Passios building, the old primary building, because as you've stated, we're not investing into those facilities.
Yeah, and by the way, that's okay if we can say that openly and honestly, right? Like if our intent is.
We're intentionally.
If our intent is to neglect it because we're going to replace it, then I think that's an okay answer, but I think we need to be honest about it.
Right. Yeah, definitely. But the other side of the coin, and I'm not going to belabor it, but, I had a discussion with a citizen of this town that works in another town in facilities, and they just put $10 million into is either 2 or 3 school buildings for renovations, additions of classrooms, and they added AC to old buildings with no problem whatsoever. They use rooftop
Splits.
and splits.
Yeah.
So it's not an impossible task.
Interestingly, that building was designed for expansion, as it turns out.
Turkey Hill was.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, most definitely.
All right. Any last alibis before we adjourn? Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved or second, whichever you
Second.
need.
Moved by Mr. Passio, second by Mr. Menard, Mr. Simeoni,
Aye.
Mr. Waters,
Aye.
Mr. Passios,
I'm.
Mr. Menard,
Aye.
and an aye for myself. Good night, everybody. We will see you
Aye.
remotely on June 9th. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.